which is why we started this campaign a couple months ago. So this is an example of a protest we're doing. All of our protests are not quite as disruptive as this one. The basis of our group is we want to create a movement that has direct action everywhere. We mean direct action in the classic sense. So nonviolent protest, civil disobedience. So that's what we try to do. Encourage people to stand up and speak out more forcefully for the animals.
What do you say to someone who believes that it's all part of the course of things for animals to eat other animals? It's part of our evolution to eat animals.
Sure.
It's natural.
Sure. I think, David Hume wrote a few hundred years ago that what's natural is not necessarily what's right. And I think if a tiger or a lion or some carnivore were imposing upon you or coming down upon you, you wouldn't say, all right, this is just nature, I might as well just let her kill me. And the same would be true of a human being coming down on you. You wouldn't say, oh, human violence is natural, notwithstanding the fact that for thousands of years human beings have been killing each other. We don't just toss our hands in the air and say, like, oh, this is not a problem because it's a natural phenomenon. I think we say, we want to be treated in the same way that we should treat others in the same way we want to be treated ourselves. And since we ourselves demand kindness, generosity, respect, equality, we have to give the same to others. There's a big gap in this movement between people's perception of the animal rights movement, I mean the public at large, and what we actually stand for. I think what we stand for is something it's very consistent with people's basic intuitions. I mean, people have dogs and cats at home that are more important to them than people suffering in the third world. And they appreciate that these dogs and cats have feelings, that they have social and emotional lives that ought not be disrupted. And all we're trying to do is extend that logically to the same animals that have equally, sensitive lives and equally conscious minds.
Dogs, cats, humans, some people see them as kind of being on like a higher level than some of the animals that we eat normally in the United States as food, such as cows and chickens. So
sure.
I think some people see it as there's some sort of difference in experience between those two groups
sure.
of animals. So how would you address this issue of a differing sort of consciousness
sure.
of the two groups?
So the first thing to note about that is, just as a factual matter, there are certain animals, in particular pigs, that are far more intelligent than not only dogs, but many members of our own species. So a pig is the intelligence of a 3 or 4 year old child. A pig is far more intelligent than many mentally disabled human beings, and we don't say that children or mentally disabled human beings don't have rights because they're less intelligent. But the second and more important point is, even if these animals were less intelligent than us, and I think there are certain animals that are significantly less intelligent than pretty much all human beings. So for example, I'd say mice and bats. The question is not whether they can reason, not whether they're intelligent, whether they can suffer, and whether they have lives that are worth living. And I think it's hard for us to get inside the head of a bat, but if we could get inside of a bat, we'd understand that the consciousness of a bat is all the bat has. And if we don't have to take it away, why should we?
So, okay, so that's, there's kind of a value for every animal's experience, not just our own, and
yeah.
It's pretty easy to empathize with that if we consider the pets that we keep. What about people who say, but meat, it's just so good, it's just so tasty, it's like God's gift. Why would you reject this, this gift of nature?
In many cultures in the world, they haven't eaten meat for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they don't miss it at all. So there are villages in India where Hindus and Jains have not eaten meat for as long as they can remember, historically and culturally, and they don't seem to have a problem. But the second thing to note is that even if it is an intense pleasure that we can't overcome, I mean, there are many people who have very kind of violent pleasure instincts that we just deny because they're violent. So for example, pedophiles, some of them are, it seems like, just compulsively driven towards violating children. Rapists sometimes are compulsively driven toward violating women. We don't say that, oh, there's nothing we can do about this because they just really want to do it. We say, you may want to do it, but there's another person we need to consider too. And the same is true of animal rights. No matter how much you like meat, you also have to appreciate the perspective of the animal who's confined into a tiny crate or cage, who lives her entire life in suffering and then has her life cut short by a bloody blade because someone loves her flesh. That's just not a good justification for violence. What do
you say to someone who says, veganism is extreme and we shouldn't judge people for doing what they want to do, and we should let people make their own choices about food?
Historically, any movement to confront a widespread tradition that's violent has been conceived of as extreme. And Peter Singer is the one who pointed out that a few hundred years ago, when Mary Wollstonecraft first wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, many very distinguished scholars laughed at her and said, this is ridiculous and radical. I mean, how could we possibly give women the right to vote? They're clearly inferior to men. And you've seen the same story, whether it's civil rights or gay rights. In the early stages of these movements, people have always seen them as extreme. So extremism in the defense of justice is not a bad thing. And in a society where tens of billions of animals are tortured and killed worldwide every year, being extremist or radical, I would say, is not such a horrible thing. But again, I'd come back, the second thing I'd say is come back to the intuition that we all have about animals. When you look into the eyes of a pig or a cow and you see her suffering immensely, if someone were to say, you know what, I don't want this cow to suffer, and took her out of the condition of a factory farm or abuse or torture and put her into a grassy pasture and let her live out her natural life, most of us would say this is a great thing. And in fact, you know, if we saw someone beating a pig to death on a public street, all of us would call the police and say, what is this man doing? He's some sort of horrendous criminal. He's just abusing and torturing this pig. But for some reason, when it's institutionalized and it happens to 10 billion animals instead of one animal on the street, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't think about it. So I think, again, it's extreme only when we accept traditions blindly and without thinking for ourselves what these traditions stand for. When we actually look behind these closed doors and think logically about why it could or could not be okay to torture and abuse an individual animal, I think we come to the same conclusions that the animal rights movement has come to, which is that every one of these animals deserves to be free. And that's not such an extreme position after all when you scrutinize it. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Is there anything we left out? Anything you want to add, or?
I think the most important thing is, you know, look into this yourself. Don't accept your traditions blindly. And in every generation over the past 200 years since the beginning of the Enlightenment, there's been massive change. And we'll see change in the next 40 years too. So the question for you as a viewer is, do I want to be part of that change, or do I want to be left behind and be in the dustbin of history?
Be sad, be sad.